All right, it is 8:30 and MAGFest is replete with amazing things that are happening all day and night, so I don't want to take up any more of your time. We'll just go ahead and get started. Welcome to Games at Work, a serious games primer. First, a brief introduction. My name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm an adjunct professor of computer game design at George Mason University. My studies and focus is largely on transmediation, moving works from one medium to another. I also teach game history and basic game design, as well as some programming concepts to first and second year students. In addition, I started Winter Ion Game Studios, which produces Ion Gaming on YouTube. Panels like this one are available there to watch, all sorts of topics, ranging from video games and opera to not too distant future, the Noir panel we held at 3:30 p.m. today. So if you are interested in all sorts of academic game talks, those are available there, as well as Ion Gaming, which is my friends and I basically taking the equipment that I got to do all this educational stuff maybe 5 or 6 years ago, not getting credit for it as an undergrad, and deciding instead of returning the equipment to start a Let's Play channel. But this is a serious talk, so a quick overview of what we're going to discuss today. We're breaking this into two topics. The first is games as educational tools. We're going to briefly talk about two authors, Johan Huizinga and Clark Apts, the books that they wrote, and the concept of serious games, what they are and why we make them, and give you some examples, different genres of serious game, if you will. The second topic is going to be patterns of design. If you are planning on making a serious game, what are some of the considerations you need to make, the thoughtful types of design you'll make, and we're going to give some examples of serious games in each of those spheres, as well as some tips for communicating your own ideas if you decide you want to make a serious game. I will try to leave time for questions and answers at the tail end. We should probably have plenty of time. This isn't too long a discussion. If we do run long, I'll take any further Q&A after the hour out into the hall. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with a brief talk on Johan Huizinga. This is a name that might be familiar with you if you've heard the concept of the magic circle. Huizinga says that the very fact that play has a meaning implies a non-materialistic quality in the nature of the thing itself. The core concept he's tackling in Homo Ludens, although he focuses mostly on the socio-cultural importance of play, primarily where it comes to domestic and international politics, a lot of wargaming as well. Some of the early talks about play arise from discussions about sort of wargaming scenarios. The same thing happens when we talk about early tabletop gaming like Little Wars, other recreations of real-world conflict. Huizinga recognizes that play is an effective tool and an important one for sort of defining rules, training and exposition of those rules. This is a concept that's a little bit familiar if you've ever watched a nature documentary and watched little animals tussing around and sort of play fighting, right? It's the same premise. There's sort of a defined concept that is meant to mimic a real-world corollary, and by practicing it in sort of a safe environment, it's skill training for the future. The magic circle that Huizinga describes is this idea that from within this confine, the rules change. We have some defined things that make this play, that make this a game. If you are on campus and you run up to someone and tap them on the shoulder suddenly and forcefully, you're going to be referred to a committee. If you are playing tag, however, right, the rules have been defined. The action is still the same. You run up to someone, you tag them on the shoulder, but because you are doing this in a defined area with a defined set of rules, which is to say, if I touch you, you are now it. I now have to run away. We may have some adjustments or careful tweaks to that set of rules, thoughtful considerations like no backsies. The idea that you can specify rules for a space, you have the power to define within this locale, and that is sort of, I don't want to say it's the definition of a game because we're always fighting over the definition of a game, but it's an important concept in that it reinforces that it's simultaneously a space for learning and recreation. This gets referenced multiple times in newer language, about 30 years later, by Clark Apt, who writes Serious Games. Clark Apt's Serious Games is a critical text for anyone who is interested in developing games for anything other than pure entertainment, especially traditional games. His lens is almost entirely through the tabletop. This makes sense, right? It's published in 1970. This is a work that tackles everything from Model UN to games you play in the classroom to try to teach subjects to students. Clark Apt says, a serious game is a game that is designed for a primary purpose other than pure entertainment. He's important not to say that it's not designed for entertainment. He recognizes and states quite clearly in the text that games are fun, games are entertaining. That's partially what makes them such effective teaching tools. We'll get into this again in a little bit, but games are really good at capturing people's attention, right? You sit down, video games, bright, flashy, depending on how they're designed, but they're really good at getting initial interest, focus. The question is what they do with it when they have it. Serious Games is sort of a foundational text for any serious game that you plan on making, or really anything in the video game sphere other than rote entertainment. And let's talk a little bit about what some of those serious games might look like. Some of the most common examples, we have vocational or productivity-based software. If you're trying to train someone for a position or a career, sometimes these get a little off the rails. You may remember the virtual reality KFC trainer that had a little bit of a Portal vibe to it that came out some years ago. It was a little bit how to work at the company and a little bit sort of dystopian future. And then, you have more serious practical training games. We've managed to, you'll dig up and find training for companies on cartridges for systems or, bizarre CD-ROMs that are instructional guides for all sorts of vocations. These games are not always the most exciting because they're kind of confined to whatever the vocation is, right? A job that is more interesting or less interesting may be more or less interesting to create a game for. So you have to be pretty clever as a designer when you think about the mechanics of play. This gets into, there's a concept called chocolate-covered broccoli, the idea that you can put a fun veneer on something, but if the mechanics don't really match what you're trying to reinforce, it doesn't succeed in its goal of teaching the vocation or teaching, the concept. Simulation of scenario. This is recreating some sort of real-world thing. Before we started this talk, we were talking a little bit about IBIS, which is a virtual fire simulator that students at George Mason University produced in prior years. It's a really exciting tool that they can license out to different fire departments that allows them to simulate things like backdraft and real physics, fire science concepts. If you're not familiar with it, fire departments have to build a building. They have to set the building on fire, and then they have to run into it. You train in this, and it's very dangerous to be in a burning building. At least you need a panel for that. It is expensive and timely to burn something and then have to rebuild it. So to any time you can spend in a simulator, right, is going to afford very cost-efficient training and mean that by the time you actually get to the serious, setting the building on fire portion of it, that you are sort of further ahead in the game, right? That fewer trials of that hopefully are needed because you have a certain amount of experience going into it. And those simulation of scenarios occur for those cross all sorts of careers. Persuasion and awareness games. These are serious games that are designed to try to bring enlightenment or awareness to a topic to sort of get an idea out there. The games that tend to be the most effective in this are ones that get someone to play long enough to realize why they are winning or losing. One of my favorite examples of this, and this is partially because I live in the Washington, D.C. area, is the gerrymandering game. And this is a game in which you start by trying to build a state with so many congressional districts. Okay, easy. 2-2, split it up, maybe geographic boundaries, rivers, lakes, mountains, whatever. You create very simple, kind of natural-looking counties. And each mission, the requirements get harder and harder. Your goals get more and more partisan. And it doesn't really matter because it's not talking about parties so much as like your side, their side. And you have to start carving things like, how can I make 8 districts go for my party and 2 go for the other party, but the 2 for their party are like 70-30s that we don't care about. And every other one is like a 55-45 for us. And the end result is you get these gnarly, unbelievably sort of convoluted districts, which actually look like a lot like the districts that we have today, because by playing this game and getting farther and farther into the weeds of focusing entirely on gaming the system, you learn to get really good at it, but you also really learn how it's done. You understand the motivations behind it. The game effectively teaches you by challenging you to do, the same real world thing. It's games like that that really effectively teach their ideas. Health and fitness games. If you have a Switch and you don't have Ring Fit Adventure and you want to punish yourself, I highly recommend it. It is a tremendous, I've gotten more of a workout, I think, playing Ring Fit Adventure than I have just about any Xer game for any system that I've tried, and maybe since World Class Track Meet. It is a very intense game. It focuses on different muscle groups. And the nice thing about it is you can sort of pick and choose a workout that you need, because the things you do in the game are almost like gear or equipment that you choose, right? I may go into a level equipped with jumping jacks, crunches, and leg lifts or something. And the game, you use those like your attacks in combat. But if you are doing certain types of workouts or you're shifting things day to day, you can shift your equipment to match it. And then artistic games. All games to some extent are artistic, and I like to think for the most part we're kind of past the whole our games art argument, although I will say there was a panel on that earlier today at MAGFest, and I'm curious to see the recording of it. But some games are made to express concepts, to explore style or design, or to communicate something in a way that is more important to the creator than the entertainment of the person playing the game. And that's, again, really the key difference here when we talk about serious games is not that they aren't fun, and it's not that they aren't made with entertainment in mind. It's that it's not the primary motivating factor. Entertainment is there, they're fun or entertaining to play, but there's something else motivating the creation behind it. And it can be as pure and simple as they want to create something beautiful or something horrid, because art can certainly be both. That kind of covers the overarching basis of topic 1. Hopefully that's a simple enough definition of serious games that we can start to get in some examples, because I'd like to spend the back half mostly focusing on things you can do or things to consider when you're making them, or any questions that you have in the audience for what you would like to tackle and how you might do it. So let's talk a little bit now about the patterns of design, some common forms of serious games, and some tips for communicating. In addition to this, I've got some examples of each, pulled some clips that we can talk about these different types of games. The first one, I'm going to do a little bit of a plug here. Like I said, I do teach George Mason University, and GMU has the Virginia Serious Games Institute in the Prince William campus. The VSGI is a seed program for graduate students or people who want to build, we give them a couple years of residency. They have offices. They get the support of the computer game design department. We've had a lot of great projects come out of that. The IVIS project I mentioned is one of them. The project we're going to see the video demo for here in a minute is another. But the game concept here is a direct simulation game. A direct simulation game is one that models an object of learning in an attempt to sort of recreate an experience. These are vocational training, but these can also be informative, as Viper, the game we're going to show in a second, is. The purpose of these is rote. It is practice. It is seeing something and doing it over and over again. These are not nuance-based things necessarily. Depending on how much effort you spend designing them or building them, they might be more complicated, but the primary purpose of a direct simulation game is just to give someone exposure to something. They say 10,000 hours to mastery. It's kind of an old shorthand for how long you have to spend doing something to get, to a master status of it. But for a lot of these things, it's just you need to get enough exposure to something that you are familiar with it or experienced with it. And that's the case with this game here. So this is a Department of State scenario training program called Viper, and this video is from September of 2020.
Designing a video game with an important concept and get this, some major funding to support you. Sounds like a dream come true for some people. Well, it's reality for a group of students and grads. Here's John Henry with that story.
Pac-Man, Punch-Out, and Pong. Yeah, these classics were all fun, but who would have ever thought that video games would one day be used to protect people? Well, they're way ahead of you at George Mason University.
Gotcha! I have a team that's actually working on a game for the government.
This is the Virginia Serious Game Institute, and here some college students and recent grads are working on a project to prepare security agents who go to work at embassies in high threat level areas abroad.
The State Department came to us and asked us to develop a training game.
Never imagined I'd end up making a training simulator.
The game's called Viper.
Do a playthrough, see how it works.
And student Benjamin Lane is one of its programmers.
We aim to create like a sandbox, like a playing field for the agents to kind of go in and create their own scenarios and kind of like role play different kinds of situations.
George Mason says one day the game will include 37 virtual models of real-world embassies for agents to train in. But today it's all based off a government training space in West Virginia that the team traveled to see for themselves.
So we go to the embassy, we film or take pictures, and then I create whatever I get from those pictures.
My favorite thing about this project is that we're recreating the actual environment of the facility.
That's not all. The group even got a grant from the government to make the game a reality.
There's $100,000 in money that you've received.
Yeah, I think that the grant demonstrates that the State Department really does take this seriously.
That's a huge thing. It gets people to learn.
From George Mason,
We're enriching people's lives.
John Henry, WUSA 9.
So this has been in progress for a couple years now, and it's a little funny hearing like, oh, and there's also a lot of money involved, but it is true. This is something that I have to tell parents, as you can imagine. When we have new students come in for orientation, one of the things the parents immediately want to know is, well, my kid really wants to make video games, but I'm worried if that doesn't work, what happens? And I do have to be honest because, it is a very competitive space to get into, to make especially entertainment-based video games. It's a very demanding industry. There's only so many positions available. So one of the things that's nice is when you're a 4-year program like we are, not only can you say, well, they're going to take a lot of core classes, they're going to get a lot of additional competencies that may give them additional opportunities outside of gaming if that doesn't pan out. But it's also nice to be able to see something like this and say, this technology, the things you're learning, the 3D modeling, the programming, these art and design concepts have real world usefulness outside of the game sphere. And you are living, in the Washington, D.C. metro area. You're in the heart where sort of technology like this is in high demand. So even if, say, it doesn't work out or you end up doing this sort of as an independent developer, and you're still looking for some 9-to-5 work, that there are a lot of opportunities in this sphere available. The next one we're going to be looking at are cognitive skill development games. These are the 90s term edutainment, right? The idea that you are playing something in order to build a skill or build some knowledge. But these brain training games can be used both for acquiring new information and reinforcing old information. And one of the ways these work effectively well is as therapy tools. People who are recovering from things like PTSD can use haptic feedback devices to learn to do things with gentle or fine motor control. People who are recovering from surgeries or injuries can work in virtual environments, such as the one that we're going to show here with Johns Hopkins in a second. But these reinforce skills and allow you to sort of develop learning through pattern. And the purpose for these, again, is to sort of exercise the brain. People always talk about things like, well, Tetris helps develop spatial reasoning. And there have been enough papers on that you can sort of pick whatever side of the argument you want to when it comes to that. If you really asked me and twist my arm, I'd say it probably does a good job activating the part of the brain that helps you think about spatial reasoning. So maybe for the 15 to 30 minutes after playing Tetris, you'll be scoring better on, a test that focuses on that part of cognitive ability. I don't know that it's necessarily doing anything long-term, but you can get it to show up on a chart if you want to. But we do definitely know that when it comes to things like muscle memory and practicing motion, games that have sufficient feedback and are designed well can do a great job of activating these. So this is from June of 2020, and this is a physical therapy game that was developed by Johns Hopkins.
Oh.
Right, so you can see it's designed to take sort of Kinect style inputs, interpret the user's motions and behavior, and it's things like getting comfortable, moving your center of gravity, making multiple simultaneous motions, right? Like recognizing your hands sort of for propulsion, cross-country style, and sort of interpreting what's happening on screen and balancing. So for somebody that's got, issues with balance or hip movement and the like, this is, a simple tool that they can use to make physical therapy entertaining, but also meaningful, right? The game is designed, you can have someone's difficulty or the amount of strain they need to do based on wherever they are in their recovery. As a designer, you can get pretty flexible with what you're asking of the patient. And again, it's important to note here that your design is going to reflect on the end result for the patient. So these can get very, very specific, which is why it's really important, and I'll stress this again later, have subject matter experts in the room, right? If you are making a physical therapy game, obviously you want to have qualified individuals who can come in and tell you, the motion right now, your game's motion controller is having them lean too far to the side, right? That's not a natural motion for the hip. If you're trying to recreate real world motions, for a while, Wiimotes were a popular choice because the gyroscopes and the accelerometers in them. However, the tools that Unity had for interpreting the input of a Wiimote weren't great. A friend of mine, Greg Tamargo, did his level best to make a nice serialized Wii tool, like a plugin for Unity, but sometimes the motions weren't very predictable and they weren't very natural. And again, if you're trying to do physical therapy, those are both things you really need. Haptic feedback devices can get kind of specialized and kind of expensive, which is why typically these things are usually done in rehabilitation or hospital settings. This example here is a little closer to the Kinect, which was, I guess, in its heyday, was sort of an Xbox 360 device that was designed to interpret points on the human body and translate those into movement in-game. And then finally, demonstration through mechanic. This is perhaps the most common serious game we see. This is the core of what makes a serious game work generally. It is making it that the thing you do in game, the purpose of play, the mechanics of play, teach your idea, right? Strategic observation, knowledge through discovery, indirect methods. Early edutainment titles would do things where they would give you a basic game and would sort of paint learning on it. Imagine something like War of 1812 Monopoly, right? War of 1812 Monopoly is not going to teach you a ton about the War of 1812. You might memorize some key terms, but for the most part, it's going to teach you how to bankrupt your friends because it's Monopoly. That's what Monopoly does. It's the purpose of the game, it's the objective. It's going to teach you to always buy the orange group. It's going to teach you to avoid, maybe you get good at calculating luxury tax. I don't know. But it's not going to really teach you a lot about the War of 1812. Demonstration through mechanic is, like I mentioned earlier with the gerrymandering game, it is when your games play and the process of learning to enjoy the game or get good at the game, those are the things that indirectly teach you the subject that you're trying to consume. And these are experience-based learning, right? This is as you develop skill in the game, this sort of lines up with the skill that you are trying to teach or the knowledge you are trying to impart. In the example here, this is a very popular example, is the now root beer manager game. As a professed lover of all things root beer, I couldn't resist the urge to kind of shoehorn it into the panel, but this is from Harvard.
So-called Harvard Root Beer Game is a team-based business simulation in which players manage a factory, a distributor, a wholesaler, or a retailer of root beer. At the beginning of the game, the root beer isn't popular, but then it becomes a big hit. Each player now needs to decide what to do as they examine inventory, anticipate demand, and write orders. The game is played at top business schools because it teaches the importance of open communication and teamwork.
So the Harvard Root Beer game has definitely advanced over the years. It's also shifted from the beer game to the root beer game. But the game's premise is to give players incomplete information, right? It gives them just the basics they need to know to start, right? You run distribution, you run retail, you run manufacturing. And the sort of the story beats of the game, changing the economy around root beer, opening up opportunities, and then allowing the players to recognize, what their patterns of play are and kind of to naturally fall into them. It's designed to lead students into sort of open collaborative business practices. It doesn't say step 3, do this, step 4, do this. There isn't a ton of hand-holding, so there's a little bit of social reliance. But the game's definitely advanced, and if you find digital versions of this, it's very good at giving you a lot of the collaborative tools that are needed to do sort of the economic steps that are needed. And it relies on the players to kind of fill in the gaps in terms of coordinating and sort of attempting to take advantage of this sudden boom market in root beer. But again, this is a game that is not designed to teach you, right? It does not say, at this price point, you should do this. At this price point, you should do that. On Tuesday, root beer is going to be bad. On Thursday, root beer is going to be good. Plan accordingly. It is a game that sort of gives the framework of how to, do your part of it, your position in the root beer supply chain, and allows the flow of events almost from I guess if you think a tabletop style, almost a game master style condition changing for the game, that the players learn through their collaborative experiences, sort of how to interoperate that supply chain. And so this leads us into some tips for good, serious games, some design patterns that you should try to follow if you plan to make them yourself. This goes for tabletop stuff, video games, everything in between. Remember that games hold attention, but playing teaches. The best serious games will teach through the interaction with the mechanics of the game. Simply playing the game, sort of getting your hands on the controller or being in front of the table is great for getting people's attention. But it's the mechanics of play, it's how the game is designed that's going to determine how well it's able to convey the lessons it's trying to teach. You can put all the information in the world you want into the instruction manual. You can have all the exposition you would like. If your education comes from a narrator who is just putting text on the screen, your players are just going to keep hitting A and going on to the next screen. The mechanics of play have to be responsible for conveying the lessons. Right? We think back to sort of some of the more memorable games sort of in the edutainment sphere. I think of, Carmen Sandiego came with an encyclopedia, but the mechanics of play forced you to pay attention to what was being said and what was happening on screen and learn little facts about the world. You did some cross-referencing, but by and large, it was the interplay of what you were seeing on screen, what you were being told by people, that determined where you'd fly next to try to, catch up to one of Carmen's minions. The paint is rarely the lesson, right? This is our chocolate-covered broccoli concept all over again. Don't describe your lesson over an existing game. If the game is designed a certain way, it's teaching a certain thing already. And if that's not the thing you want to teach, you need to either pick a different game or make a new one. The most effective games are going to teach through play. And then finally, bring in subject matter experts. Depending on what you want to teach, always assume there's someone out there who can teach you more about it yourself. And especially if you are doing something like vocational training or simulation training, try to get subject matter experts in the room, right? They're going to be able to double check your concepts. They're going to be able to tell you, this portion of the game is particularly effective. This one's less. Maybe we should spend more time working on this part. They're going to be able to tell you things like you are over-exaggerating movements. They can tell you that, the physics of the game don't necessarily line up or match up what we would experience in the real world. These are the sort of things that you would get normally from QA in an entertainment-based game, right? It's just a different type of quality assurance. In a serious game, the QA is going to be things like, it's too floaty in the sense that you don't feel the weight of the motion, which means that if you're trying to recreate this, you're not necessarily going to have the same effect when you swing in the real world. Or your flight simulator, when you're looking at the dashboard, I can tell you that we changed the dashes 6 years ago, and the altimeter moved from here. It's now farther over to the left, and they're no longer using that blue tint to it. It's now all monochrome, right? So if someone is, doing flight simulator for 1,000 hours and then sits down in the cockpit for their first commercial flight, and half of the console things are in different places, you're at a competitive disadvantage there. So anything you can do to kind of effectively emulate that real world corollary is effective, and never doubt the power of the people who are already in that position to give you that information you need. With that, that concludes the lecture portion of this. We still got plenty of time here, so I'm just going to open the remainder of our time here to questions and answers. So if anyone has them, fire away. Yeah.
Companies that are requesting someone to develop a serious game are using typical game development engines like Unreal Engine.
So the question is, what engines do we typically see in the serious game space? Yes, I'd say more often than not, you do see things like Unity and Unreal being floated for serious games. That is as much because the developers are comfortable with those and they can prototype in that and they can provide a demo for a client in that in a way that if they have to do custom engine development or if they're building something from scratch, right, it doesn't necessarily flow as quickly and it's more difficult. If you have a contract secured in advance before you're getting to the prototyping phase, right, if you file an RFP and it's all paperwork and you secure some sort of funding and you do need to build from scratch because it makes more sense to do so, that certainly happens, but I'd say that's the exception and not the rule. In the back?
Bigger pressure to create serious games and how much easier it is to recreate that?
I think the pressure with VR has come more from the expectation of clients than it necessarily has from developers. There's a lot of clients who will say, well, we want to recreate this concept, right? We want to teach people about this, and we want to do it in VR, right? Because it makes sense when you think about if you are taking this from the perspective of business, well, we want to close someone off, we want them to experience only our space, and we want to have control over that space because we feel if you can give the audiovisual presentation as realistic as possible, then maybe it will be as effective in training as possible. Sometimes that's true. That's not always the case. Again, going back to sort of the traditional textual rules of serious games, the mechanics usually have a stronger influence on learning than the audiovisual inputs. So, if you're spending too much of your time and your budget trying to make something looking right without necessarily feeling right, that can be challenging. But yes, I do think there's a pretty heavy push to go VR. Viper is an example of that, but oftentimes those VR requests are coming from people who are looking for more experiential training, right? So in their case, it was the State Department dealing with potential scenarios and emergencies. We've had other software that I've worked on or I've seen worked on. The U.S. Postal Service, who is an amazing client to work for. They're some of the nicest people over in L'Enfant. They don't have the ability to come up with new ways of making money on their own. They have to go to Congress to get those passed. So anytime you can save them money, you are an angel in their eyes. I was part of a group that did energy simulations for them, where we took geospatial code and basically determined, if we reroute all of your mail trucks, this one goes down this street, this one goes down this street, we save about $500,000 a year in gas costs. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but that's the sort of thing that just, if you can do it for them, they're the happiest people in the world. And there are just replete with opportunities all across state, local, federal, for software like that. Not all of it's gamified. A fair amount of it is, just because the type of input it takes naturally fits into game engines anyway. And a lot of it is spatially based, but there's also, perfect opportunities for simple, logical-based scenarios, almost board game style gaming, which you could just as easily do in a textual medium as you could an engine. Here first.
Is there any literature to show that a person playing the game or being exposed to an educational tool has any information that being an educational tool affects the actual teaching of it?
So the question is, I guess, in short, if you know you're playing an entertainment education hybrid versus something that's just designed for entertainment, does it affect the outcome? I have seen one or two studies that think in young children it does. I suspect it's probably a wash. I don't know how big the sample sizes were on something like that, but it's the whole, if you tell somebody you have a game for them versus you tell them they have homework, how excited are they going into the experience? You're kind of coloring them going in. And I think that the best studies tend to be ones that don't rely too much on sort of presupposing ideas on the subjects before they go into it. I wouldn't be shocked if there is, but again, the best edutainment games are the ones who can capture your attention and then sell you on the mechanics. So whether you're being assigned a video game for homework or you're just playing a video game because it's available on the market, when it comes to teaching younger kids, typically I think you can get around that pretty easily. Here. Optical as in like eye training or? Optimal. Optimal. Okay. So the numbers for optimal, I guess, if you want to call it attention span, they tend to be fairly parallel with what we see in like web media, right? They say you have to have someone's attention in 2 minutes and you can't have it for longer than 10 to 12, really. I find that differs based on the type of game. I've had students play serious games in our classroom, and within 10 minutes they've given up and gone to something.io to go eat, bugs on a screen. But then if you give them something that's a little more narrative heavy, they'll sit and chew on that for an entire class. That's age specific, obviously. Most of the students that I've got are either undergraduates or the occasional graduate students. They have longer attention spans anyway. Younger students, I think it's probably, without any hard numbers, without any large studies, right now I'd say parallel to web media is probably your best bet. There was a question here.
What were your favorite or at least most effective serious games for you growing up?
For me growing up, not to date myself, but some of them were monochrome. I think I had an early version of number munchers for Commodore 64. I know we had a couple Apple II games. I was never a big Oregon Trail person, but that was out there. I did like Carmen Sandiego a lot. I think it was called Outnumbered by the Learning Company. You were a character kind of wearing a large puffy jacket and a hat that was kind of down, and you were in a TV station and you had to solve a lot of math problems in order to, to get the TV station up and running, and you had to avoid a robot in the process. And there was just enough platforming for me to think it was a video game. And I was just dorky enough to enjoy doing math problems. I'm not ashamed to say I was a mathlete in second grade, but that's probably one that sticks out in my mind too. Yeah.
How is entertainment and realism balanced? It seems like you were saying, that people would sort of become disinterested in something.
Yeah, so the balancing of entertainment and realism, this gets back to what your game is intended to do. So for something like a simulator that needs to create a real-world experience in order to teach it, you have to err on the side of realism. You're kind of doing a disservice to your student if you don't. For things that are designed to teach concepts, you can kind of get away with being a little more esoteric, right? If you wanted to teach something on, bless you, if you wanted to teach something on, say, the Lewis and Clark expedition, there's nothing really stopping you from painting it as a sci-fi epic if you give them roughly the same challenges, roughly the same time spaces and experiences. You can kind of conceptually teach those ideas, but they may not pick up the facts. If you're doing something that's more factual based and they need to know sort of exact, you're teaching names, you're teaching dates, you're teaching locations. Again, the subject matter kind of forces you and drags you back to that realism. And it's a little bit like the trade-off triangle. You'll hear a lot in software design. You can only have 2 of 3 things, right? We can make it quick, we can make it cheap, we can make it quality, right? And you have to pick 2. We can give you something that's incredibly inexpensive and you get it immediately, but it's going to be held together by, baling wire and string. We can give you the best game ever made immediately, but it's going to cost $4 quadrillion. So in the same way, when it comes to, educational games, realism is kind of one of those things that tugs you in one direction, and it compromises how much expression you can have to try to get more creative with the, the sort of the veneer or narrative of the game to teach whatever your subject matter is. There was a question behind you?
Yeah, I was wondering about the effectiveness of implementing leaderboards and competitive kind of spirit to things that might be more experiential. So if you're really trying to, doing training for retail, and I'm trying to kind of motivate people who aren't necessarily super enticed to do this game. So I'm thinking of doing like a dating sim type of format of speaking to customers, but I'm wondering if it would be worth it to sort of generate like a point system, and then people can kind of compete to do better and better for multiple playthroughs as like a motivation to keep trying.
There are pros and cons to something like that. Anytime you add in a leaderboard or scoring-based system, you are adding competition. And as a designer, I guess you have to kind of step back and say, do I want to create a competitive atmosphere between my employees, right? Obviously, this is something kind of, not say silly per se, but are they going to be very competitive about what score they get in a training element for some aspect of the job? Depending on how serious the trainer was and how critical this training was to them learning something, maybe it becomes something more serious. And there is the risk of sort of, not to say HR related problems, but that you are sort of building a competitive environment. I didn't score as well as so-and-so, or, I'm embarrassed because I only got, a 75 on this, and everyone else can now see I only got a 75, So that there are some risks there. Obviously, there are lots of, tried and true methods that we have to build engagement for games, and games by their nature are already really good at getting people to kind of sit down and try them. A leaderboard isn't the first thing I would try if I was trying to build something like replay value, or trying to get people to give my trainer, multiple tries. I might look at something more like incremental play, changing the gameplay up from time to time. Or if this is something you want them doing, say, repeatedly, over the early months of their, time somewhere, doing things that are monthly or seasonal, taking a couple lessons from maybe the MMO community, that, making slight adjustments to your game over time so that it doesn't feel repetitive or rote. There are lots of ways you can get re-engagement without going to competition. Then again, I guess if your game is about like maybe, training salesmen, maybe there are maybe rare edge cases where you do actually want to create, competitive environments. Here.
Leading into the topic of the demographics of these kind of educational games, is there a certain demographic, or I can imagine certain demographics do not tend well to wanting to play games. And is that a focus of this kind of work that you're saying, okay, well maybe the people joining the military might not like games as much as people that make art or something like that?
The good news is that tends to be the exception and not the rule. There are all sorts of game players in the world. It's more about what kind of game than it is whether or not it's a game. You may not know this, but what do you think the number one use of AARP.com is? Dating. Dating is the number one, but games are number two. Games on AARP.com, seniors, that's the number two thing they want to do on that website is play games. Gaming is ubiquitous. It really, really is. It is now the biggest industry in terms of revenue. The ESA numbers out there, it's beating books, it's beating movies, it's beating sporting events. Gaming is here, and it is here in a big way. I have to kind of recalibrate myself when I teach because my students will say, yeah, I grew up playing the PS3. Right, it's a little tough for for those of us who inherited a C64 or an Atari 2600 and have kind of had the benefit of growing up along the side of the stuff. But we were used to this being counterculture in a way that it just isn't anymore. When you think about people who don't play games, it is true. There is definitely a subsect, but there's a group of people who don't play sports. And there's a group of people who don't read. And you will have to maybe find alternate ways to get to that group, but the good news is games are generally pretty good at capturing large chunks of people. It's just a matter of knowing that, like you said, the demographics of that group and what game or games might appeal to them. For edutainment games, younger audiences, usually anything from platformers to quiz games, adventure games, very effective and popular. I think of like a lot of the humongous titles, for example. But yeah, you can, if you can find the genre, if you can find sort of the audiovisual hook, you can get just about any demo to learn something from a game. One more thing, I'll take your question in a second, but I guess one more thing I want to mention here is when I said we had the benefit of growing up along with games, one of the other things that I think is just important to note here, skill development occurs when you are playing games. Soft skill development occurs as well. Pearson education takes account to how effective people are at using computers. Because when students go to school, how well do they use a Windows operating system? How well do they understand, concepts like files and folders? What's their words per minute if they sit down and type? And from the 1980s to about the mid-2000s, that was skyrocketing. Students were drastically increasing in their knowledge and understanding of operating systems, their words per minute, their ability to basically work in white-collar jobs was just booming because a lot of us were playing games in DOS and Windows, and we had to learn these things if we wanted to play. We developed soft skills just typing on keyboards and using the mouse to play games in a way that was not the intention of the act. But again, remember, when it comes to serious games, and this goes for soft skills on devices as well as the lessons you were trying to teach, you learn by engaging with the mechanics of play. In around the mid-2000s, the smartphone catches on, right? The iPhone's released, becomes the next big thing, and these consumer-based devices catch wildfire, right? And in the next 15 years after that, kids are growing up with tablets and phones instead of PCs. And we very clearly see in the educational data, the words per minute plateaued and then starts dropping. Students' understanding and comprehension of operating systems plateaus and starts dropping. There is a good chunk of students, even at the collegiate level, that do not understand concepts like files and folders and operating systems. And they don't have those soft skills that their parents did because they did not grow up with PCs in the home. They grew up with smartphones, smart devices, consumer devices. And it's unfortunate because these aren't really productivity tools. These are consumer tools. Phones are really great for buying things. Phones are really great for consuming media. Phones have some productivity, especially in the sort of the new media, social media setting. I think about journalism or video recording and the like. And in that sense, there are some effective tools that they have there. GarageBand was particularly useful for a while on remote devices too, but it's not the kind of thing that's designed to really sit down and teach you to be sort of an office worker, for better or worse. So we do have to recognize that there's a rise and fall to those things as well. We still have about 10 minutes left. I know we had a couple more questions. Yes.
Do serious games experience the same culture as crunch that entertainment games do?
I imagine that like any other industry they do. I'd like to think there's less. I personally feel, and this is something I've worried about because I've got family that works in the sphere. Some work in companies that focus more on family and sort of care more for their employees. And if the game has to come out 6 months later, it has to come out 6 months later. I've got extended family that works for companies where it's like, well, maybe we'll see them. Maybe they'll fly back over to the East Coast next year. They're just too busy making this game. And they're working nights and weekends. Unfortunately, the game space is hyper competitive. And these companies know they have an army of 20-somethings waiting outside the door, dying to get their foot in that door, dying to work for that industry. They're willing to take $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 less a year than their same skills would get them working outside of the game space because they're that passionate about it and they love it. And I completely understand that. 100%, as someone who teaches students to go try to get their dream job in the game industry, I completely understand why you would sacrifice time, why you would sacrifice money, that you are that passionate about the sphere that you are willing to endure those conditions, try to get it. And it ends up being too much for some. And I certainly don't condone the practice. I guess just the cynic in me recognizes where it comes from. I think in the case of serious games, the companies are smaller, generally a little more focused. The teams are a little easier to manage. One of the things you get a lot in crunch is critical path issues. If you have a team of 100 artists and animators, and they're relying on certain things being done with IK handles, or we got to get this through one pipeline before we can get it to the team to texture, or these textures that they did aren't going to work for this model, so they're sitting on their hands till the model's done, or we need to take them and pull them off this team. There's so much complexity that comes into a large AAA title with that the opportunities for the critical path to kind of get crimped, and the pressure to meet those Gamescom deadlines, E3 deadlines, whatever it might be, are a little higher than you would have in an environment, especially if you are working like on a firm fixed price contract, or a time and materials contract where you have a little more flexibility with the income. I think there's probably less opportunity for that, but I imagine there's also probably fewer people, in that space. Yes.
Amazing talk. I run a nonprofit that creates serious games primarily for local government, and I have a question for you as far as future trends in this space.
Sure.
One of the things I've noticed is we're getting a lot of requests from local government, specifically around community engagement, and it kind of ties into what you said, not only with tying developers to subject experts, but also impacted members of the community, that want to voice in the design process and what it'll be. I'm curious what you think the future trends are as far as how these tools are being used and what specific spaces. You think this area that we're talking about, this can be used as an engagement tool at the local level? Can it continue?
So I'll give you, I guess, a little window into where I think the future is. I think a lot of these other firms are going to figure out what social media companies figured out 10 years ago is, for better or worse, mostly worse, you can learn so much from user data. You can learn just a frightening amount from user data. I mentioned the AARP and the games thing because I had a personal opportunity to make games for AARP. I had what was probably a $5 million contract to produce a series of mobile games for them. And the amount of user data collection that would have occurred with that process is frightening. You think about things like how effective is somebody at, swiping or, turning, how well do they interpret your UI stuff? Are they playing in the same place every day, or are they mobile, right? Do they get out of their house, or are they stuck in their house every day, right? Are we marketing, wheelchair or accessibility devices to them? Are we marketing live-in care assistance to them? How targeted you can get with your advertising and the information you glean on. Remember, this is like the biggest representation group. Like the ARP is the biggest lobbying group in the country, and they have just a massive amount of members, and almost all these members just ubiquitous ownership of these devices. And you get your game software onto these devices, and all of a sudden all those games of Canasta and Bridge and Klondike and Mahjong, right, are learning so much about the user's competency and ability to utilize these devices that just becomes an almost invaluable thing that you can sell and market. And the amount it would have made in that user data alone so laughably dwarfs everything else. But it also means that basically you're doing intense case study on, senior competency with electronic devices on a day-to-day basis. And I do think there are going to be a lot more of those types of projects. You're going to have developers who realize that user data is out there, it is available, and Facebook, Twitter, whatever, don't need to have a monopoly on how they absorb that data and what they do with that data. Yeah, it's not just the attention of it, but competency, because if you're developing user interface, and this is something you can sell to other developers, right? What people in this space, right? What this demo can and can't do with a tablet, what they can and can't do with a phone, how good they are or aren't at doing something. And that's valuable information, right? Because that's going to determine the size of a user base for a software going forward. In the back. I don't spend too much time in the commercial space, admittedly. Most of what I know is state, local, and federal. My day job is for Tyler, based in Herndon. So, we're the largest contractor in that sector already. And then on top of that, with George Mason and VSGI, it's all like local and state government stuff typically, and obviously the federal thing with Viper. So I don't have too much knowledge what the commercial space is doing in terms of demand for stuff. The KFC one's a fun example just because of how ridiculous I guess it is. If others are out there, I'm sure they're either, I guess, mundane enough to have kind of slipped under the radar, or aren't necessarily consequential enough to have pulled the press that did. I'm sure, just because I know how attractive or enticing games can be, that there's potential value for that, especially if you need to train employees on things that aren't as interesting or enticing. But I guess the thing is, when you work in the commercial space like that, once you have to do something for a job, like once it's the thing you need to do to get your paycheck, what games do best, like grab your initial intention and make you want to do something, the paycheck's already doing that, right? Like the idea that you are employed to do this task kind of already overlaps with this, it is fun to do this task. And it can be helpful and reinforcing. I think in things like rote simulators where you need to put someone in the same scenario over and over and over and over again, gamifying can be helpful and useful because it helps clear the monotony out. I think for something like what KFC did was sort of that initial, like, welcome to your job, this is what you do. I'm not sure it's quite as useful because that engagement is novel, but the amount of time you would need to do it to stick, it probably would lose interest quickly. right, we are at 9:30, so I'm going to go ahead and cut things here. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to meet me outside. Additionally, you can find our stuff, Winter Ion Game Studios, is at watch.winterion.com. Or you can reach me through George Mason University. Again, my name is Daniel Greenberg, and thank you for coming out.